Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are delighted to begin with our session this afternoon, Photographs and Memories. You know, as a teacher who's been teaching history for the greatest part of my career, history is one of the most disliked subjects in school. I think second only to mathematics. And when I ask students why they dislike history so much, typically the answer is because history is a mugging subject. History is taught as a series of battles and kings and dates to be remembered, and no wonder that students don't take an interest in it. Which is where this afternoon's session becomes so relevant. What if we looked at history with the lens of oral history? What if we looked at history as stories which have come down the generations within a family? And to share their thoughts with us this afternoon, we have a very diverse panel of experts, and I really can't wait to get this conversation going. And Sarmistha, if we could begin the deliberations with you. Sarmistha has written a book on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. That's been her research topic. And the book has been written in the form of a journal, which moves from the past to the present. But my question to you, Sarmistha, is that you have, in the course of your research, unearthed a number of stories which were hidden, which were, as you beautifully put it, discarded stories. Could you please tell us, how do these stories throw some fresh light on an event which is so well known in history as the Jallianwala Bagh massacre?
Thank you, Amita. Yeah, to just give a bit of context, all of us know about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, but what we have seen right now, it's the 105th year of the massacre, but in school or college textbooks or in popular media, in films, what we get to know is what happened on the 13th of April, and maybe a little bit about the Rowlatt protest that went before it, and immediately after, how Gandhi and the Congress led the nation into this great surge of anti-colonial nationalist movement, non-cooperation movement. That's all that's the knowledge usually circulated across India. So when I began my research, I was greatly disturbed. The more I began to read, the more I began to sort of be disturbed by these gaps because I noticed local narratives, diverse narratives, completely overshadowed and wiped out. It's only the statist narratives that got prominence. For example, stories of how the First World War impacted Punjab and how that led to this tremendous mobilization of people of Punjab in the Rowlatt protests and leading to Jallianwala Bagh, or hundreds of women who survived the massacre, how they have been completely invisibilized in this entire, all the discourse that we have around Jallianwala Bagh. So there are many such disturbing gaps and silences. So what I tried to do is, I tried to pick up some of these stories, within quotes, discarded by statist representations of history, stories which would make unseen faces and unheard voices visible and audible. And that's where some of the things that I wanted to focus on was, stories of survival, not so much stories of martyrdom, but what about the people who survived the massacre? How did they do that? And also, how do we make women visible? So many of them who lost the next of their kin and, fought back and resisted accepting compensation from the British and brought up their children and their family. I know two of them whose families I got to meet in the course of my research. And I got to know that both of them were carrying babies in their womb and gave birth to posthumous children. And they refused compensation. Look at their patriotism and their bravery and the way they survived brought up children. Some of them even lost those very same sons or daughters that they brought up during the partition riots, and then they again picked up threads from there and looked after their, their daughter-in-law or grandchildren who had lost their fathers or brothers maybe during the partition riots. So bringing back these voices and these faces of women into that history. Also stories of survival, like I'm just going to share one story, the story of Sundar Singh and his family. Sundar Singh died at the Bagh. He was shot dead on 13th April. He was a 17-year-old young man. He had gone there with his father, Gyan Singh, who was a fresco painter at the Golden Temple in Amritsar. And the father tried to carry back his son on his shoulder, but the child didn't survive. Now, what happened after that? That is the story I wanted to, ask, and the families were extremely generous in sharing with me those memories and those photographs, all the material memory they had. And what I found out was even more, poignant to me, and I write about it in my book, is that first of all, they couldn't cremate the body because there was severe repression. Martial law was already imposed on Amritsar from 14th April. And 2 days later, when these families were given permission to cremate the dead, the father of Sundar Singh didn't have money to cremate. And none of the relatives would come in support and lend them money because everyone was scared. The British would chase them. The police is going to chase the families to any links if they found with the links to their presence at the Bagh. So finally, this man who lost his eldest son had to borrow money from a money lender to cremate the son, and for several years after that, the family had to repay the money lender. And how? The man I spoke to, nephew of Sundar Singh, his father, who was Gyan Singh's younger son, he had to go and carry water to the money lender's house every morning and evening for 5 or 7 years until that loan was, with interest, was repaid off. So that's the kind of stories of survival that I wanted to. That's one of the, the kind of discarded stories. That's one I just wanted to share with you all.
No, thank you very much for that, because as many of the students of history would know, otherwise something like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre occupies just maybe one tiny paragraph in a typical school textbook. And it is these stories that actually make one understand what is the human face of such an event. Tapti, if I could come to you, and there is so much in common, because Tapti runs this blog. It's a collection of stories, and so many stories, and each one of the stories that I managed to read is something which is really, it completely changes your perspective of the event that it is in the context in which it is written. So may I please request you, Tapti, if you could talk about maybe one such story from your collection which would change one's understanding of a historical event. In fact, when we were chatting, you mentioned the World War, for example, and how the narrative that is there in the history textbook is so different from what a story reveals. So may I just request you to please talk about that?
Thank you, Amita. Am I audible? Yeah, okay. It's difficult to choose one story out of 137 stories. But I'll start at the beginning, which is how this particular blog started. And it's a sequel to my work as a scholar in history and a teacher in history. And the reference point, of course, has to be 1857, and I'll talk briefly about it. However, the blog started in 2016 out of a conversation with an elderly person who said, Tapti, I was in London the day the war broke out, World War II, which is 3rd of September, 1939. And that's how and she had written about it, and that's how the day the war began is the first story that we carried on our blog, passconnect.net. Subsequently, we had several Second World War stories which questioned the basic definition of victors and the vanquished, of perpetrators and victims. And Amita, I'll choose and I'll talk about very briefly 3 stories which are related to Second World War, but there are other events and other moments in history which fall by, as you said, fall by the crevices till you retrieve these personal experiences. And that's what we wanted to record and revive and, keep on in the public domain. And the second reason why we started this blog was how these stories connect people across the world. Now, this was in 2016. Things were looking ominous all around the world, and we felt that boundaries and borders and divisions these stories had a way of actually overlaying them. Now, there are 3 very short stories. The first is of my neighbor, a Polish neighbor, whose grandmom was, she worked as a maid, actually, in a German family, the borders of Germany and Poland. So after the war, she had to leave the family, and she worked for a Polish parish priest who really treated her very well. Subsequently, when the boundary lines were drawn, she had to come home miserable. The priest had given her some money, which at the borders, the Red Army, I hate to say this, the army soldiers took away the money, so she came home penniless. Thing is, and she never regretted the fact that the last time she slept on a immaculately white sheet was in a Polish priest's home. Her brother was a soldier a Polish soldier who fought for the German Reich, because that was the way it is. After the war, all these Polish soldiers were, they were identified, a lot of them were punished, and her brother had to spend his life escaping from the victorious army. Now, Poland was part of the victorious, they were part of the Allied. Now, who is the victor and who is the vanquished? That was one. A similar case, a similar story was from Latvia. Once again, a woman with 3 daughters lost her husband, her second husband, and then she had a huge farm to run. Now, suddenly, this was, again, the Russian state decreed that they could not hire Lithuanians, you see. And yet, she didn't have anybody. And there were very few Latvian youth that she could actually hire to cut her harvest. So then anyway, they did hire a Lithuanian. And the story is about how she suffered at the hands of the victorious army. Once again, as history teachers, we question who's a victor and who's a vanquished. My final story, and very briefly, relates to how an event in 1945 connects to what is happening in Europe and all over the world now. This story is from 2017. An Indian scholar, she boarded a train from Frankfurt going to Amsterdam. And a lady boarded the train as well. She did not give her own name, but she said, I must tell you, out of the blue, perhaps it was because she was an Indian, and this was 2017, as I mentioned, so the beginning of the migrant problem in Europe, and the fact that they are unwanted and so on, the discourse that we all are familiar with. This lady says, you know, I'm German, and once again, as history teachers, we will know. So my family lived in in Silesia. Now, Silesia used to be a part of Poland, and then it was divided, and it came to Germany, or it was in Germany, went to Poland, something of that sort. Anyway, her family had to flee Silesia after the war, and they were forced to flee to somewhere in the West, to another very, very poor country. This is Germany after the war. And nobody liked them. They were not wanted in this German village. So they lived with a farmer. That's what they were. They had asked. I mean, the story itself is very poignant and very, it's extremely tragic what happens to these people. So they were forced to put up with a farmer's house, and there her father, for every meal, had to kneel and beg for food for the family. Now, this is a German fleeing from one part of Germany to another part of Germany. Both of them are vanquished. Therefore, I leave the question open. So this is what stories do. Now, this is only one part or one section of the 137 stories. If time permits, I'll talk about the rest as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, Tapti, I do hope we will have time to come back to you and to Sarmistha for some more insights, because it's truly fascinating. And I would definitely urge everyone in the audience to make time and read some of these stories. We've been talking about memories. Now for some talk about photographs. And Ramona, I'm going to request you to come in at this point. The title of your book, The Lady on the Horse, I believe has been inspired by a photograph. Can you please talk a little bit about the photograph, and how did you write about it?
First up, I want to clarify that history is not the second most hated subject in school. After mathematics, that would be chemistry. And Mrs. Prasad was also the best history teacher we've ever had. So it's not entirely a surprise that my first serious fiction is historical fiction, where it's a family saga which spans 5 generations. And this photograph, well, I'd already started writing the book, and I was about halfway through when we hit the pandemic, and my mother went up to the attic and found all these family photographs, started opening her albums, and this really cool photograph fell out. It was exactly as the title says. It was a lady on a horse, and she's riding side saddle. This is in Chittagong, and it turned out to be my mother's grandmother. And she's in a riding habit, and I was like, oh wow, like we did not get cooler through the generations. That was the pinnacle. And even though I'd been writing something, I'd been writing a character based in the between 1900 to 1930 was the time span, and she was a particularly spunky character. And even though my great-grandmother did not go on to do the things that my character did, one of my protagonists, Preeti Lota, I could just imagine that Preeti Lota could have a moment like that. So that photograph, and the reason why the book is called that is because that photograph is the only concrete object that binds the 5 generations, and it goes down from generation to generation.
Right. Thank you very much, first of all, for that really, really feel-good comment in the beginning, but also how something just like a photograph can actually get you to explore and write such an interesting novel. Which actually, and I'm going to come back to you a little later on that. But first, Brinda, I would like you to please come into the conversation at this point of time, because like Ramona talked about her book being a 5-generation thing, but in the case of your book, which is In Search of Shobha, it is about this one remarkable woman whom you discovered. So could you please talk about a little bit about who this person is, and also How would a book like this help the reader to get a more nuanced version of history than what you would read in a textbook?
Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. So Shobha was my father's mother, and I only got to know, I knew her first name, and I didn't know much else. And I got to know about her because I found this little packet of letters after my father died. And so the book is about the discover or trying to find out who Shobha is, and it was really tough because, of course, by the time I got to do this, most of my older relations had mostly died, and also we didn't know very much about a lot of it. I knew a lot about my mother's family because she came from an exceedingly prominent Bengali family, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, so we knew all about that part of it. But my dad's family, we knew nothing about because he was a very reticent, quiet man and didn't talk very much. So it was only when I found these letters that I was able to understand that actually she was a remarkable woman. And so it has been, and it continues to be, a journey of discovery, of trying to find my roots and trying to make sense of this. I am the mother of 4 grown-up adult daughters, all highly independent women, and I used to always think that a lot of it came because of my mom and her family, who all were pioneers in many ways. But it actually, I think a lot of it came from Shobha, because that's who she was. She did a remarkable, lived a remarkable life. You know, you asked about, I think you do read, I mean, and I know what you're talking about, history, and I think history comes alive if you have a teacher who makes it alive for you. But in this particular case, you know, you talk about social movements and you talk about emancipation of women, and yet, and what I found while I was doing the research and finding out, reading about my grandmother, and trying to find out about it, is there actually little incidents. For instance, there's one, so the Brahmo Samaj believed in the emancipation of women, and the schools were, they were beginning to educate women, and most families didn't want their girls to go to school or to learn to read and write and things like that. So in Kanpur, where she founded the first school for girls, she realized that, okay, she could get across to the Hindu families and they would send their kids, but it was the Muslim families who didn't want to. So she used to go in the afternoons. She had made a small cart surrounded by curtains, and she would go from home to home and pick up some of the Muslim girls who would then be in their burqas and then come to school, and they would take off their burqas. And she had promised the families that no men would enter the school. So she got a call to say that the inspector of schools, the Britisher, was going to come and actually see the school. And she had to then go to his office to convince him that, sorry, you can't do that, because all these students will stop coming to school. So it shows about, I think when you talk about strong women or emancipation of women or the kind of issues that you read about, you know, you read about things in your history book. Oh, women were not allowed to read and write, or women were not encouraged to be educated. But the truth is that it's incidents like this that bring it home to you, make it real for you, that such things do happen, you know. And so while I was writing her book, and Amrita asked me this question the other day when we were talking, and I thought, gosh, yes, there are so many little incidents that show that she had to go outside her comfort zone and do something, ask for something or fight for something. But more than that, the book has actually been a very personal journey. I mean, we grew up in exceedingly very anglicized families, and traveled all over. My dad was in the army, and then I married somebody not a Bengali. So we were not, we didn't sort of belong to any one community in that way. I used to always envy people who had all the sort of things like, so I belong to this community and had the rituals and things like that along, to fall back on. But when I was growing up, my dad used to say that you are a human being first, and so you can just be anybody, and that was very much the Brahmo teaching as well, and no question of getting married and things. You've got to fly first, you've got to earn, you've got to be educated, and then think about things like that. So this book, writing this book, helped me actually understand where I'm at and where I come from, really.
Thank you very much. I think, Brinda, that's it's quite remarkable, and I can see from some of the faces in the audience, you really struck a chord there when you're talking about how a journey in writing a book can actually be a journey delving into your roots. Ramona, if I may ask you a supplementary question here, a little different. Some of the incidents that form the backdrop in your book are historical incidents like the terrible famine in Bengal or the partition of India. And yet what you're writing is essentially a work of fiction. So could you tell us how true to history, or how historically accurate do you have to be when you are setting a work of fiction in a historical context?
So I would say that the backdrop is historical, and therefore the backdrop is fact, but the foreground is fiction. So the foreground is what I'm making up. But the character, so if I want to write something which is set in 1942, because I find myself, when I found myself going back in time and then I come to 1942 and I want the characters to behave a certain way, I also have to take into account the socio-political culture of that time. So even if I want two people, say, to get together in 1942, I can't ignore the fact that there was this terrible cyclone around October 1942, and that the famine was slowly approaching in 1943. So even if, no matter what your personal journey is, you will be affected by your circumstances. So I would say that the background, as far as I know, is factual. I'm not a history student, but I did a fair bit of research. What was actually interesting was that I looked at the New York Times archives, and in that Times Machine section, you can put in any date and you can just search with Calcutta, and they'll come up with these really small incidents every day that could have happened, like a brick fell off a procession on AJC Bose Road, and then there was a mini riot there. This wouldn't be big enough to be recorded in larger history books or sources, but the people, if you're living there around that time, you would have been affected by something like that. So things like that is, so I've covered, this is how I've covered, say, the famine. Then, of course, because it was 1946 was even bloodier in some ways than 1947 in Calcutta because of Direct Action Day. I think if you were alive around that time and you knew people who were out and about on the road, especially if you happen to be living in North Calcutta, then you couldn't not but be affected in some way by Direct Action Day. So I tried to mold the background to the foreground. So.
Tapti, if I may request you to come into the conversation at this point in time, because, just like Ramona was talking about the actual human stories that are set in a historical context, from the stories that you have researched and the ones that you have collected, could you share maybe a couple of more stories? And I'm particularly keen that you share some stories on migration, because that is what gives us really a human face to something which can otherwise have just a fleeting mention in a history textbook.
Thank you, Amita. Now, migration in this case brings me back to India, the subcontinent. And I'll start with this, very briefly talk about one incident you know, this is, we all know here about the Bhaval, um, when Bhaval case, you know, the Maharaja of Bhaval who disappeared and came back after 12 years. There's a story that we carried of the great-grandson of the Bhaval Maharaja's older sister, Indumoi. And what happened during migration in 1947, and how this young girl who actually lived in the palace had to come away literally with the only clothes that they had on their backs, and had to spend months, if not years, crammed in a 2-bedroom house. So the thing is, the fate of these prominent families, which otherwise find a lot of mention in history, is lost. But that fate links them to other phases and other kinds of migration. Now, migration is associated largely with war, and of course partition in the case of India, either in Punjab or in Bengal. But migration as all history students know, has always happened in history, for time immemorial. One thing among the Bengalis, and this will all the Bengalis would know, is we use a word called Probashi Bangali, or Bengalis who've actually migrated at different times and settled somewhere else. And so there were 2 stories on the last story that we carried, or for Probashi Bangali. What kind of crises actually lead families to migrate from one place to another? And 2 very interesting stories. One is of a Brahmin family who was the treasurer to Murshid Quli Khan in early 18th century. And what happens to this particular family? It's too long a story for me to actually recount now. But the family moved from Murshidabad to Banaras, and then finally to Lahore, and then Srinagar. Now, this journey also maps to a different kind of journey that we find in 18th century Mongol Qaboos. I mean, there is this whole the whole trajectory of movement that I think it's true for different parts of India, but this trajectory of journeys that take place from one region to another. And the last story, of course, that we carried recently, is of a widow, once again, driven out of from her village in Nodia because of cholera. And she had the only person left in the family was her son and her nephew. So she took a boat, traveled up to Benares. On the way, I think she stopped by in Gorakhpur, left behind her son, left behind her nephew, to be raised by another Brahmin family which had a lot of, the family which had many daughters but no son, and then moved on to Benares, and that's where she set out her roots. Once again, the interesting bit of the story is the family lore. Now, these family lores, are they history? Are they historical? Or are they myths that families dip into to create a different kind of identity? So, one very common trope is, of course, a poor Brahmin son reading by the street light. So, did Bidashago do that? We still don't know. But certainly in this story, this little boy was spotted by another teacher because he was reading by the street light. So now these are stories which circulate, which swirl within the family, and a blog often offers a good opportunity to put them down because they are short and they don't necessarily feature in history books or longer narrative, printed narrative. Thank you.
In fact, it is precisely these stories, I think, that make for such interesting reading. And Sarmistha, I'm going to come back to you on this point because one point I feel that your book makes very strongly is that in telling these stories of sacrifice, in telling these stories of some kind of great personal loss, are we actually, as Tagore put it, monumentalizing memory? So keeping this very, very important question in mind, could you tell us what inspired you to delve into people's memories in the course of your research in Amritsar?
In answer to your first question, as I was saying, that first of all, I was deeply disturbed by the gaps and silences that I noticed around, knowledge circulated on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where, people's voices and survival stories and the invisibility of women and all of this was, and the delinking of partition with the massacre, which, every time I spoke to almost, every second family that I spoke to who were affected by the massacre continued to be again a second time uprooted or deeply afflicted by the partition. So that lens also is extremely important to keep in mind. But anyway, while I was, the other thing that that sort of, the lens that I went about while writing the book is when I read Rabindranath Tagore's comments, that the letter that he sent to the International Congress Conference in 1920, when the first anniversary of the massacre will be observed. So the Congress had mooted the proposal of setting up a memorial at the Bagh, and that's when Tagore sent a letter through his friend C.F. Andrews expressing his reservations about the idea of monumentalizing memory, because first of all, he, as all of us here know, that he was not against remembrance. He has so many songs and so many poems which talks about remembering, remembering people, remembering things. Very, very evocative renditions have happened on those, on his creations. But he was opposed to imitating the colonizers, setting up monuments in the way it was done in Kanpur or Lucknow after the 1857. So he thought that this is, if you set up a memorial garden or a memorial column like that, it's an imitation of the colonizers. So what are you doing by doing that? And then eventually what he predicted is so true. If anyone visits the Bagh, you will see that it is just a brick and mortar monument now, representing the state and completely divested of human memories, of any connections to the community living there, people's stories, complete.
And people having a picnic, as you said.
Yeah, and it's turned into an amusement park. So the thing is that I grappled with this, the notion of sharing of memories versus building of memorials and structures, brick and mortar things. So what we are doing now when we are going to the Bagh, we see that erasure of history has happened at several levels. Now there's no time to talk about those. But all I want to say is that I was hugely inspired. And, I was talking about discarded stories. Now, Tagore's reservation around the, construction of the memorial of the Bagh, one cannot say it was discarded, because there was a debate at that point when he put out that letter to the Congress. Gandhi did reply to him, and it was published in the Young India. But later on, it's got completely suppressed and overshadowed in our history, this whole take. And all we have is his letter relinquishing knighthood. That's kind of publicized everywhere across. But this very, very important statement has just got brushed under the carpet. So if not discarded, this has been overshadowed and suppressed. And my takeoff point was that letter, and I used that to look back and try to trace, counter this depersonalization that has happened, and trace people's stories and their emotional connections to the site of the massacre, to other stories of violence and martial law repression in Punjab of 1919.
Uh, we don't have much time, and before we open it to at least a couple of questions from this audience that we have here today, quick questions for Ramona and Brinda, if you could just give us short responses on a personal note. Ramona, while you're talking about 5 generations, do you think things have really changed for women over time?
I do. Yes, I think because most of my 5 generations concentrate on women. The focus is on the women of the families, and I think some of it is how they suffer with because of the actions of men, but especially in the generations which span 1900 to 1950s, they have a little less. They're able to fight their lot a little less, especially without severe repercussions. So one of them chooses to, but the repercussions are dire because it's not just easy to walk out, even if she chooses to do it. Some can't because it takes a lot of courage to just walk out. So then they absorb the repercussions as opposed to the repercussions being outward. But as we come closer and closer to modern times, I would say that the youngest generation, which would, I think, coincided with about my age group, they were able to take the onus of not only their lives, but also repair some of the damage done by their ancestors. But I did that specifically because of some catharsis that I wanted for the reader and for my characters. But they were able to undo a lot of it, and they could act the way they did only because it was the 21st century. And it was far more difficult for their grandmothers and great-grandmothers to have taken a specific action. Even if they felt, some of course would have felt that they were being taken advantage of. Some would have absorbed the patriarchy so deeply that they would have felt that no, this is right, so no one should do anything against it. And so there were some women who were heroic in my book, and if there were women who weren't heroic, I wouldn't blame them because they weren't able to cast aside all the repercussions of their actions and just do what they wanted to do. So yes, I think it's getting better.
Yeah, yeah. And Brinda, quick comment from you. As you were delving into your roots in search of Shobha, is there something you discovered about yourself?
Yeah, possibly a clearer identity of who I am and where I've come from and what to be proud of. We, as I mentioned earlier, we are grown up in where there are very little definitions actually of that you belong here or you belong there. Hugely anglicized. I only learned to speak Bengali after I got married and came here, grown up all over, and English is my language of communication. So it helped me certainly get an understanding of this incredible heritage that I have. It also made me understand my dad a lot better. He was a very quiet man and I hadn't spent too much time. He was in the army, and so yes, it was yeah, it gave me a lot of peace by the end of it.
So that's photographs and memories and a little bit from this very erudite and very diverse panel talking about how stories and memories can help to plug gaps that formal recorded history sometimes fails to do. I think as per the timer, we have 2.5 minutes left for audience questions. Please go ahead.
So thank you for the amazing session. And I can totally see that, you know, historians are not just sensitive, but also the best people ever. So, but, you know, you know, histories, we're always concerned with the accurate or with dates and particularity and the social and economic condition. And here we're talking about historical fiction or oral histories and memories, which also are treating the line between history and human emotion, so to say, which are which can be universal as well at the same time particular. So how, in your various ways, do you then treat this particular line of the universal as well as the particular in treating your characters, and what really as a writer becomes the priority, talking about that particular family or person's personal journey and history, or then can we then zoom out and think about other people, you know, make generalizations that probably people belonging to a certain gender or class or caste were going through the same kind of experiences, and then zooming out, can we then like talk about more universal human emotions? So, I mean, if that makes sense.
May I request Ramona to respond to that, please?
I'll respond because mine is fiction, and it's based, as I said before, the backdrop is historical. I think the focus has always been the personal journeys of the characters, because that's what, because I'm not writing a history book and I'm not writing non-fiction. So that's basically what will strike a chord with the readers. And after that, of course, you have to make it believable in that particular setting. So no matter, so if you're writing about various classes, which is what I do in the novel, then yes, 1943 famine, for instance, the point that I was making was, and this is a point that researchers, including Amita Sen, has made, that this was a class war. So only Calcutta was not affected, but the outskirts really were, which is why they were coming into Calcutta and dying in Calcutta. But Calcuttans and the rich Bengalis and the Jomidars were eating like never before, like people weren't dying outside their doorsteps. And so you can't, if you're writing a certain, if you're talking about a character from a certain background, then you have to be true to the facts. So it's not, it would have been unreal if perhaps the Jomidar wife, unless there was a certain reason for her to do, she was not the one who would be dying outside the gates. But if there was someone who's dying outside the gates, who is that person, who is that backdrop, where did he come from, and then you write the whole backstory about what brought him to that gate. And then the personal journey is something that you can make up, but you possibly, it would not sound realistic even to a reader who does not know history if the reverse happened.
Just before we come to that, I think that question also warrants a response from a serious historian. So, Sarmistha, would you like to respond to that as well? Because
Thanks
then you
for
get
asking.
both sides.
I think that's a very good question. And for me, I think what I try to do in my work is that I constantly try to juxtapose what I get in archival records, conventional sources of history, along with the oral narratives that I personally go and source. So I authenticate each and every source that I get from written records, and then I dig into personal stories and I juxtapose and then try to connect the dots. So it's not a choice between the universal and the particular, authenticating all of it and bringing forth untold stories through historical records, because you also have to treat oral narratives as historical records. They are not fiction, and they are not soft history. I think it's time we kind of recognize that. Thank you.
We'll just take one more question before we close the session, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a lovely session. My question is for Sarmistha ma'am, specifically because you mentioned about Rabindranath Thakur's comment on monumentalizing, memories. So we live in Kolkata, where the basic essence of nostalgia that is associated with our city is also associated with the colonial aspects of the architecture we find around the city. So when we are talking about how monumentalizing our city is full of monuments. So when you're talking about this idea of monumentalizing memories, are we also critiquing how, we experience Kolkata in that matter? Because Kolkata is full of colonial history and we glorify that. Certain, institutions, because of the way they are built, we are proud of that. We express our, we are from Kolkata, so-and-so buildings are from here. So are we critiquing that in that, if you look at it from that lens?
I think Shormishta will, she specifically requested you to respond to that, so please go ahead.
Well, you want to take this,
No,
Tapti? Why don't you take it? Yeah.
If I may, but you have to answer as well. You know, this is not a colonial pursuit at all. I mean, Rabindranath's critiquing was a different thing. But if you look at history, every phase, there is a memorial to it. I mean, be it a palace, be it a temple, be it a mosque, be it a madrasa, be it whatever. So everything, the materiality of history remains through or is perpetuated through different forms of memorialization. So, you know what I mean? So when we celebrate, I mean, these are colonial buildings, of course, but there are pre-colonial buildings as well. You know, you have Tipu Sultan's mosque, and all of these are times in history and therefore they also play a role. So just as oral history, as Shormishta said, oral narratives have to be interrogated, just as archival material has to be interrogated, just as material, you know, a particular building needs to be interrogated, and then you have all these different stories spilling out. Some are recorded, some remain in memory, some remain in family lore. So if you put them together, and as Amita would endorse and Shormishta would endorse, history is not a closed box. So we are redefining, reinventing history every day. So these are new inputs to the creation of a new history.
Tapti, I think we couldn't have got a better conclusion to this scintillating session that we've had this afternoon. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. I would like to mention that a special word of thanks to the AKLF team and especially to Anjum. I think she's just gone in, but she's the one who got us together. And thank you very much, Anjum, wherever you are, because it's been a delightful afternoon. And to my co-panelists, a big word of thanks for bearing with me for all the delays in communication and so on. But it's been an honor and a privilege to be here with you. Ladies and gentlemen, the authors will be available to sign their books after this session. If you've been inspired to read, and trust me, each one of them is worth reading. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here.